The coronavirus pandemic has led to massive labor income losses all over the world. That is according to the International Labour Association, the ILO. Workers lost almost 11% of their income in the first 3 quarters of 2020. That's a total of $3.5 trillion. Lockdown measures and closed factories and offices have affected almost everyone, but lower middle income countries have been hit hardest.
More and more families have been arriving in Sao Paulo's new favelas, bringing everything they own. Gilmar Gonçalves Chavez is building a temporary shanty for his family. Prior to the coronavirus pandemic, he worked as a day laborer in construction. The downward spiral began when he stopped receiving job offers. Our landlord wouldn't let us pay the rent later. And because we couldn't pay on time, he kicked us out. Then we found out that a lot of people who are going through the same thing were building shanties here, so now we're moving in. The International Labour Organization estimates that in the second quarter of 2020, 17.3% of working hours were lost worldwide due to the coronavirus measures, including the closure of construction sites, factories, and offices. In terms of employment, that means a total of 495 million jobs have been lost. Government measures, including stimulus packages and short-time work allowance, have somewhat mitigated the financial consequences. But the ILO says it's mainly developed countries that can afford this. Emerging economies have limited possibilities. The results are poverty and desperation.
For more on the story, we can speak to Guy Ryder. He's the Director General of the International Labour Organization. Good afternoon to you. Looking at the pretty dramatic numbers in your report, was the lockdown worse, or the lockdowns in various countries worse than the pandemic itself?
No, we can't say that. And indeed, I think it's a mistake to try to compare the social and economic damage that the pandemic has brought with the pandemic itself. The fact of the matter is, we don't have an alternative or a choice between solving the health problems or solving the labour problems. We have to do both at the same time. And that's the challenges that policymakers around the world are facing in admittedly extraordinarily difficult circumstances.
Guy, if you look at the economic fallout, which regions are you most worried about right now?
Well, the numbers show very, very clearly that it is the Americas, and particularly South and Central America, which are suffering the worst, both in terms of job destruction and loss of income, which you've highlighted so very well in your introduction. And this, again, is linked very closely to the fact that the pandemic has taken hold so firmly in that region. The two things go together. After the Americas, the pain is pretty equally distributed amongst all of the other regions.
Guy, we mentioned also that in your report you pointed out that developing countries have been able to mitigate the effects of the economic fallout, but developing countries, as you mentioned in the Americas, are not wealthy enough to do so. So what is the solution there?
Well, the solution is very evidently a little bit more international transfer and international solidarity. Our report shows that whilst the high-income countries have thrown enormous amounts of resources, quite rightly, I would say, at mitigating the socio-economic crisis, lower middle-income countries simply cannot do that. And that's why we see the types of dramatic situations in formal sector workers who have no choice but to go to work in dangerous circumstances. So I think we do need to look at ways of getting more support to the developing world. That could be through the international financial institutions, it could be through debt relief, it could be through development assistance. But we have to do it, and not only as an act of solidarity, but as an act of self-interest, because anybody in any country who thinks that they're going to be safe from this pandemic whilst it is raging on in other parts of the world, I think is making a big mistake.
I want to ask you about one specific aspect of your report, youth unemployment. It was already high before lockdowns and the pandemic began. Is it safe to say we can speak now of a lost generation?
We run the risk of seeing a lost generation. I think the really important thing to do is to act to prevent that. Young people, as you say, were in a very vulnerable situation in the world of work pre-crisis. As the crisis has developed, two things have happened. Young people have lost their jobs in greater numbers than the rest of the working population. Education and training has been interrupted. and those new jobs aren't there. That first entry into the labour market have been closed off. So we have to act in all of those fronts to prevent that lost generation of which you talk.
And if you can give us an outlook, what will the upcoming quarters look like, especially for people in those emerging markets that you were talking about?
Yeah, one of the most worrying things in our report is that our projection to the end of the year, and there's a lot of uncertainty, is much more negative than it previously was. We'll still be many millions of jobs. We talk about a reduction of jobs of 8.6% by the end of this year. And for the reasons we've talked about, lack of resources, lack of capacity to control the pandemic, I'm afraid the developing and emerging countries will be the worst affected by this situation.
We'll have to leave it there. Guy Ryder, Director General of the International Labour Organization, thank you so much for joining us here on DW.
Thank you.